Ronan, I know you've been working on this for, 8 months? There have been rumors about this for many months. And then on Friday, 6 hours before your story came out, The Hollywood Reporter wrote about it. CBS stock plummeted. CBS issued a statement. I wonder what it's been like for you as the whole media world's been wondering what you're working on, to be trying to get your work done carefully, accurately, while everybody else is speculating about it.
Well, I think you framed it correctly, Brian. It's noise and interference, and when you work on stories involving dozens and dozens and dozens of sources, it becomes almost inevitable when there is so much riding on these important stories that I think really need to be heard, that word leaks out. I mean, this happened in a number of the prominent stories that I've worked on over the past months, and that's okay, but I do think it's important for the public to distinguish between the secondary coverage of the story, which is often fraught with misinformation, and the story itself, which is the product of many meticulous months of investigation.
You won pretty much every award in the journalism industry for your reporting on Harvey Weinstein, and I think we should try to distinguish between the different stories you've been doing. When you write about Moonves or Fager, you're not lumping them in with a predator like Weinstein, are you?
Of course not, and I think anyone who reads these stories can see very readily that we're careful not to draw any speculative inferences here. This is about the concrete details of these fact patterns. And look, in the case of Leslie Moonves, this is not to draw comparisons to anyone else, but certainly these are 6 women, and in several cases they are talking about what they describe as serious sexual assault.
Moonves says he made mistakes in the past, but he never used his power, misused his power to punish women if they rejected his advances. Do you have evidence to the contrary?
Certainly, the women's stories suggest that these are encounters that went a lot farther than that comment allows for. I do think it's striking, though, and perhaps reflective of the rapidly changing times that we're in, Brian, that Leslie Moonves does exhibit a fair amount of contrition in these responses. And I have to say that in all of our interactions with CBS and with Moonves, which were extensive, we gave them a very broad window of comment on this and worked very closely with them. Mr. Moonves personally, to me, was very, very gracious and seemed to take the claims very seriously.
Now, Moonves is one part of your story. I want to ask you one more piece about that. Right now, Moonves is locked in this epic battle with Sherry Redstone, who's one of the controlling shareholders of CBS. This has been going on for months. It's a legal battle that people have been reading about. There's been some insinuation that maybe Sherry Redstone's camp is partly behind your story. How do you react when you hear that kind of insinuation?
Well, we address it in the story, Brian. These are women that began coming to me immediately after the Harvey Weinstein story. Ileana Douglas, one of the actresses who's in this piece, called me, in fact, the day after that first Harvey Weinstein story that I wrote, and told me her story, and we've been carefully investigating since. Now, look, there are plenty of stories that are completely true and also fueled by opposition research of some time. We have vetted and revetted these sources, and my honest impression is that these stories are not only true, but also not fueled by any kind of opposition research. These are women who came in a heartfelt moment where there was an outpouring of these kinds of stories.
And you say 19 sources described behavior at CBS News, that Jeff Fager, who used to be the chairman of the news division and is still the executive producer of 60 Minutes, that he enabled and allowed for harassment to happen and sometimes made unwanted advances himself. Now, he has flatly denied this. He says your sources have an axe to grind. They're trying to hurt 60 Minutes. What can you tell us, though, about what you learned from these sources?
There's a lot of sources that supposedly, in Mr. Fager's view, have an axe to grind. And obviously this is a story that has been percolating for a long time. Certainly they describe with some uniformity, Brian, what one person in this story terms a Mad Men culture, a culture in which women are touched and made to feel objectified a great deal. And beyond that, as you pointed out, there are a number of people who talk about Mr. Fager's own behavior. I think the pivotal thing here, though, is that these sources, again, dozens of them across this story, paint a picture of the way in which a culture of alleged misconduct at the top can trickle down to various facets of even a large company.
Now, you're not the first person to go digging around 60 Minutes As you know, as you mentioned in your piece, the Washington Post was pursuing reporting about Fager earlier this year. Erin Carmen is one of the two reporters who wrote about Charlie Rose, who wrote about CBS, but didn't say much about Fager in her story. And what you report is that that's because Fager had a team of lawyers get involved. Can you talk us through that?
I can. So the Post obviously did very important, powerful reporting about Charlie Rose in the fall, and starting immediately after that, began working on a follow-up story by two really wonderful reporters, in my view of their work, Erin Carmon and Amy Britton, and they uncovered substantial evidence of misconduct by Jeff Fager, amongst other things. That story was the subject of a heated battle where the Post was subject to a lot of pressure from Fager's personal legal team. Obviously, we also dealt with Fager's legal team. And there were efforts, we report, to personally smear those reporters and their professionalism as well as sources in the story.
I was struck by what Erin said at a Mirror Awards speech in June. When you look at this clip, you wrote about this clip, Ronan. When you all at home watch this clip, keep in mind Jeff Fager's in the room while she is speaking.
I just want to say one thing. I think there's a temptation to think that the last few months have been about individual men, that it's about a handful of bad apples, and that if we get rid of them, it will end the cycle of harassment and abuse. But it's not true. The stories that we've been doing are actually about a system. The system has lawyers and a good reputation. It has publicists. It has a perfectly reasonable explanation about what happened. It has powerful friends that will ask, is this really worth ruining the career of a good man? What one woman says, what 4 women say, what 35 women say. Indeed, the system is sitting in this room, some more than others. The system is still powerful men getting stories killed that I believe will someday see the light of day.
And I believe she was talking about her own reporting about Fager that was never published by the Post. So why were you able to get this reporting out there in the New Yorker? What happened?
I think there are a combination of factors anytime a story that is this tough and where sources are this afraid. And there's a long time span where sources grapple with the feelings of ethical obligation to come forward, Brian. In this case, there was a lot of frustration that the Fager allegations hadn't emerged in that Post report. I think that there was a lot of anger about the heavy-handed tactics Mr. Fager used. I pointed out that Mr. Moonves was sort of very gracious and respectful of the claims insofar as one can be in responding to these claims. That was not the case, certainly, with Mr. Fager. You saw in his on-the-record comments there that he appeared to be sort of very angry about these and didn't engage in the facts of them, just sort of flatly denied. And I think that sources were at the breaking point,
Sorry to
Brian.
interrupt you. You quoted an employee saying the hypocrisy of an investigative news program shutting down an investigative print report is incredible. I mean, that's really the stunning thing about this.
Well, you make a good point there. I think that of the many ways in which this story forces us to take a hard look at the culture at our most important businesses, one of the most important facets of that is that it forces us to take a look at newsrooms and the need for accountability in the places that shape the facts that we receive. And for a lot of the women in this story, we talked to one investigative journalist who said, if I am in the business of confronting hard truths myself for a living, how could I turn a blind eye to this?
Ronan Farrow, thank you so much for being here.
Thanks, Brian.